Today's presentation is How Due Diligence Facilitates Successful Biotech Investments, Deals, and Partnerships. Our speaker for today is Dr. Fran Brown. Fran is currently a Senior Vice President of Integrated Drug Development and Business Operations at Certara. She brings to Certara 25 years of experience in pharmaceutical development and due diligence. She's worked in a number of geographies around the world, including the United Kingdom, Switzerland, Canada, Sweden, and the United States. Fran holds a degree in pharmacy, and subsequently she went on to earn her PhD in pharmacokinetics. Before coming to Certara, she worked at Roche and BioVitrum. Fran, welcome to today's event. I'll now turn it over to her to begin the presentation.
Well, thank you, Suzanne, for that introduction. So in addition to working as an SVP in Certara, so the reason why I'm giving this webinar is that within Certara, one of my roles is to lead due diligence assessments on behalf of investors into opportunities that arise for them. And that's going to be the focus of today's session. And it's coming out of a similar talk that I gave last year to a group of biotechs on the west coast of the US. And there was a lot of enthusiasm because for this talk, we're looking at it from the lens of the buyer and what investors are looking for when they take the step to perform a due diligence. So this is actually one of my favorite cartoons because it actually sums up the last 25 years I've spent in drug development. 1 out of 10 research and development projects will succeed. I recommend cancelling the other 9, and if only we could do that, it would be fantastic. The reality is we can't, but what we can do is try and pick the winners. We can pick the ones with the greatest probability of success. And really, this is what due diligence is all about. Some frightening statistics. So one in every 10,000 compounds that are discovered in research will actually end up on the market. And 1 in 10 of compounds that enter the clinic will become a medicine. And the frightening thing is that this ratio is the same as it was when I started work in pharmaceutical development. And only 30% of compounds that actually reach the market will recoup their development costs. And this is likely to fall even further over the coming years as the emphasis increases on being able to prove cost effectiveness and not just safety and efficacy. So what does that mean for due diligence and what it is and what the objectives are? So in a nutshell, what it's focused on is understanding for any one particular opportunity, what is the probability of success for that compound, for that program, to meet its objectives and to deliver a return on investment for the investor itself. And to do this, what needs to be understood is what are the risks within the program for achieving that end, and what are the risk mitigation strategies. No program is without risk, but some you can de-risk considerably by doing additional work, by doing things early, by having a risk mitigation strategy in place. So due diligence, really, in a nutshell, it's all about understanding probabilities of success and risk mitigation. Coming on to what investors focus on in due diligence, and the answer to this is it really depends. It depends on what kind of deal they have in mind and what they're looking to do. And on this slide, I have 3 different large buckets of deal structures. There are others around this, but most of them fall into these 3 major categories. And I'm going to start with the simple ones first, and that is when a deal is focused only around money. A company is looking to invest. And there the focus of due diligence is looking at what is the probability that they will actually make the return on investment that they are planning. And return on investment can be linked in two ways. It can be linked to milestones, or it can be dependent on royalty from commercial sales. In these instances, what is very important for this and for the probability of success is understanding the strategic competencies of the company that is doing the development and the people there. It's also very, very much dependent on trusting that that team can deliver on their promises. So understanding the project development plan, what is it going to achieve, is it likely to succeed, and how are that company managing those risks. At the other end of the spectrum, we have acquisition, which is a bit like a house sale. A company is acquiring another asset. In this situation, the competencies of the selling company have less impact because the acquirer will take forward the development and will have the opportunity to develop it according to its own plan and its own timelines. So in these situations, therapeutic fit and commercial fit become much more of the drivers. Does this compound add to their own platform, their own portfolio? Does it fit with the sales teams they already have in place from a commercialization properties? What is it they can leverage with the synergies of the acquisition? So you're looking at a very different set of parameters for those two different alternatives. In the middle of that, we actually have the most complicated situation possible, which is a co-development. And this is essentially like a marriage of two companies. And here, all of the factors I've previously discussed come into play. So therapeutic fit is important, commercial fit is important, the deal structure, core competencies of both parties is very important. And added to that, there are additional factors, and those factors that revolve around how do those two companies take forward this development together. So company philosophy becomes a very big factor. How do you control decision-making for a co-development? How do you break ties when the companies want to go in different directions strategically? All of those things now become more important. So you can see that what is the focus of a due diligence is actually very, very much driven by what the intent and the deal structure is. So just a quick overview of the due diligence process and who is involved. First thing, due diligences are not really done unless agreements have been reached on a deal concept. The due diligence process itself can cost the investor anywhere between $120,000 and $150,000 just to execute. The people that are involved in these due diligence assessments have usually at least 20, 25 years experience within strategic development within the pharma industry. So it's a significant investment on behalf of the investor or acquirer, and they don't take the decision to go forward with this unless they are very certain that all of the financial aspects of the arrangements are already in place. I don't want to read this list of the functional expertise included, but it covers the whole gamut of every function that is involved in the development of a new medicine, and also includes intellectual property, commercial, and forecasting as well. Not all of these functional expertise are included in every due diligence. It really depends on the stage of the compound, the risk associated, and the proposed deal structure, and it can be tailor-made to suit those conditions. Some practical advice. Most due diligence now are conducted through virtual data rooms. The advantages of this is people don't need to travel. It allows a very sophisticated control over data access with regard to the ability to cut and paste and download. And one advantage from the company that is going through the due diligence is that once these data rooms are set up, there's very little onward maintenance needed, and that they can be there and ready to cover multiple discussions with multiple potential partners. What I will say, from having done a lot of reviews of a lot of different data rooms, from the point of a reviewer, please create a logical structure for your data room. Err on the side of including information and documents rather than exclusion. If there's documents that are missing, then there's a time factor involved in then requesting the addition of those documents to the data room, and all of which can have a delaying factor on progressing a deal. Very useful is to have a naming convention for files so people can understand very quickly where to look for the information they're seeking. Tables of contents are also very, very useful, and most of these virtual data rooms will produce those automatically, but then they only make sense if there's a naming convention in place to start with. Please consider file access restrictions carefully. For publicly available information, it can be very frustrating to not be able to download or print it. While those restrictions are very understandable for things that are sensitive and confidential, if things are in a public domain, then it just creates a very negative feeling for a reviewer to have to go through the process of finding it publicly to be able to print it. Some advice on handling questions. Please avoid the one-word answer. The idea of due diligence is to be able to convey information and an understanding of the program. And if you're asked a question, it's because they're looking for additional information. So providing a fuller response rather than a very short one is actually much more beneficial, because the only thing that will happen is they'll ask a question again in a different way. No data room is complete. No development program is without gaps. They exist in all programs. Just acknowledge them. They're not a negative. They're certainly not a negative when they're known about and acknowledged. Where possible, support any written responses with discussions with the team itself. The team discussions have multiple benefits in that they convey your level of competence and strategic awareness to the team, and they can provide so much more than a written answer. So if you're offered that opportunity, take it, because it's very valuable. Show that you have been able to consider the impact of missing information on risk. You might know that if something hasn't been performed, you know that it should be performed, and you've marked when you will perform it. All of that conveys an acknowledgement of skill and competence and the ability to move a program forward. So what does due diligence focus on? So it's got actually, I've put two of the aspects on here, but I'm going to include a third one as we talk through this. So it looks not just at the data, although the data is a very focal part in understanding this. It also looks at the strategy. And what do we mean by strategy? In essence, there's kind of two elements to that. There's the target product profile, which is where do I want to be? And I've got a slide later that will talk about the elements of the target product profile itself. But it's based around an understanding of what you need this compound to be once it reaches the market. And included in that is an understanding of geography. So are you looking only at a US market? Are you looking at US and Europe? Do you bring Japan into that? What are the major players? Because all of this affects whether your strategic approach is going to be correct or not. And then the other part of the strategy is a detailed development plan. In other words, how do I get to where I want to go? Is it realistic? Are the timelines realistic? Are the costs realistic? Are there stage gate investment decisions included? Have you pushed CMC development in order to not make that investment until you see your phase 2A data? All of these show sort of a very strategic approach to the development process while not delaying things to the last minute where the risk becomes greater. What do you know about the risks of your program? Has there been a formal risk assessment? Is there a formal risk mitigation strategy in place? And will the whole program as itself deliver the data that will allow you to meet your target product profile in the first place? The third element that is included in this is about agreements. What we see in due diligence is a increasing number of acquisitions, compounds that have been purchased from previous companies so that they are coming with a legacy amount of data. And these can be actually one previous acquisition, they can be multiple acquisitions. They can be situations where the rights have been purchased for a certain geography, but the development in other geographies is still continuing by the original owner. So in these kind of situations, agreements become very important. Understanding what is the agreement with the previous owner for the data. Have you acquired all of the raw data sets as well as the study reports? Do you have a safety agreement in place to report global safety worldwide if you have a geographical partner? So understanding the agreement terms and what is in place is another level of risk when compounds are coming from a previous acquirer. So that was a little bit about the due diligence process. The second half of this presentation is actually focused on a look back through the last 2 years that we did. And we thought it would be very, very interesting to understand why it was that investors don't proceed to a deal. So we took a look back over the last 2 years and we looked at 20 of the due diligence assessments that we have done in that period. Only 3 of these went to deal completion. Those were not always because of the findings of due diligence. Some of the reasons that they didn't go through were related to the fact that they couldn't reach an understanding on the deal terms. There was just 2 different perspectives that could not be reconciled. But these due diligence assessments, they cover a range of diverse therapeutic areas. They were different types of programs. Some of them were NCEs, some of them were line extensions, some of them were complex generics. They were a mixture of small molecules, biologics, vaccines, cell therapies. And they were a mixture of deal types. So a very, very heterogeneous set of projects. But when we look back, there were some learnings that we think were very important, and I want to go through some of these today. And it's about the reasons investors decided not to invest. And I don't need you to read through all of these, but the take-home in this one is that the reasons can be one really major one that's a deal breaker. And you see on there we have wrong molecule. In other words, the intrinsic properties of the molecule could never achieve what it needed to achieve. But there are circumstances where what you see is accumulation of a lot of small issues to a point where it becomes affecting the whole probability of success and the probability of moving forward. So some of the reasons that investments didn't move forward, you will be expecting. Some of them were a surprise for us. So the first reason, differentiation. In other words, the target product profile was not going to deliver something that was commercially viable. And the reality is that good science and medical need aren't enough to make a drug that is commercially viable. So, and the reason that people develop a TPP in the first place, it defines the lowest threshold for success. In other words, if your compound cannot meet what you define here, it is just not a viable thing to continue forward with. And the TPP, in essence, is what drives the commercial forecast. So starting at the left-hand side, so the primary elements that go into a TPP, what is the target indication? And it's good to get down to precise wording of that indication. Which patients are you looking to treat? Is it going to be given alone or in combination? Clinical positioning, is it going to be a first-line treatment? What's the current treatment paradigm? Does that paradigm vary by geography? And if it is, then you have to separate out and you have to think about that treatment paradigms by geography. Where does your compound fit into the current treatment paradigm? Who are you looking to take market share from? What is the length of therapy and the dosing? Do you need to have an oral therapy, or are you looking for IV? If all of your competition is going once daily, then you're probably onto a losing streak if you're considering that 3 times daily is going to be viable. What's the treatment duration? And all of these then feed into a definition of what efficacy you need to see in your clinical programs to be able to meet that indication and that clinical positioning, all of which is driving the differentiation in the market. So on an efficacy side, what are the primary efficacy parameters that are required for registration? And these may not be the ones that are most useful to drive usage in the marketplace. There's a very delicate balance between what's needed for approval and what's needed to be competitive. And that leads a lot of people to put in a balance of primary efficacy parameters that are focused on registration, but secondary parameters that are focused on the commercialization. Safety, defining what success looks like for safety is a little more difficult because you don't know what safety issues are going to come up. But if there are key compounds that you are trying to improve on, if safety of standard therapy is an issue, then knowing how you're going to improve on that is an important part of your target product profile. And all of these drive the assessment of the commercial value, understanding the drivers in the market, knowing where you plan to take market share from, and where you sit in the treatment algorithm. All of these will help support the arguments you make on commercial value. A part and parcel of that commercial assessment is also the understanding of when you expect to launch and what kind of period of exclusivity that gives you in relationship to your IP. So we had quite a few examples of compounds that did not deliver expected commercial value. They were either compounds that might have made it to registration. So we did have an example of something that would have achieved, based on the data that we saw, would have achieved registration. But due to the dynamics of the market and the positioning it was aiming for, it would never have returned investment. So in the commercial and forecasting side, what's looked at in the due diligence is again, geographical ambitions. Are we looking at a forecast for one country, for multiple countries? Understanding the epidemiology and therapeutic dynamics. Who's out there to compete, and how do you differentiate against the existing therapy, but also against therapies that are more advanced in development? What clinical value do you expect to provide? What is the benefit for the patient? How do you justify that with a cost effectiveness and market access arguments. What are your pricing approaches and expectation on market share? So all of these things are things that the commercial due diligence assessment will look at. And they might not agree with the assessment. They may come up with something that's more conservative, but understanding the logic behind the generation of your forecast is very important for them. So one big thing that came out in many of the due diligences of factor was the CMC development. And CMC covers a huge range of activities, covering the production of both the drug substance and the drug product, all of the analytical method development. But on top of all of that, it also covers the commercial supply chain and how much of that is in place and what are the plans and strategies to ensure that. So it covers a lot of things, both from science and analytics right through to commercial agreements, audit history for your suppliers, and essentially the cost of goods. And there was many instances that we saw where a lot of the CMC development had been delayed, so that in essence it was running behind the clinical program and it was playing catch up. And the problem with doing that is that you leave a lot of risk sitting on the table to a point where you can actually no longer mitigate it. One of the ones you are expecting is efficacy, the benefit risk of the compound. In these areas, we were looking sort of from a clinical and statistics point of view. There were compounds where no adequate dose ranging had been performed. Companies had gone into a phase 2B study on the basis of data in 4 or 5 patients. That creates an element of risk and uncertainty. The size, quality, and endpoints for studies are important things that we look at. And also the type of patients and how they relate to the target product profile and the ultimate ambitions of where you want to be. From a clinical pharmacology perspective, in this kind of assessment, we're looking at is the exposure efficacy and exposure safety relationships, are they well understood? Is there separation between doses which efficacy is seen at and doses at which there's got to be safety issues? Always you have to think about the extrapolation of those to a population that becomes more and more variable as you go through development, and you loosen your entry criteria on clinical programs. Diagnostic. This is sort of an emerging field within due diligence, that more and more companies are trying to develop personalized medicine, individualized therapy. The corollary of that is that you need to pay as much attention to the development of the proposed diagnostic as you do to the development of the compound itself, especially when you're looking at a companion diagnostic. From a regulatory perspective, the diagnostic needs to be validated before you go into phase 3 studies where you're using it. And in many of the cases that we were looking at, what had happened was a retrospective analysis of phase 2 had identified a subset of patients where a diagnostic showed that there may be a beneficial treatment response in this subset of patients. And then that was then extrapolated to phase 3, but it was not being done with a commercially available diagnostic. And at that point, there needs to be a validation agreement in place with the CDRH in the US, if that's the way that you're going. And that can take time. And introducing a phase 3 program before that validation has occurred increases the risk that this patient population, subpopulation may not be accepted. So there's a real high dependency between a clinical program and a diagnostic development and validation that needs to be considered very early in development if you go this route. One of the surprising things that came up from our point of view, actually far too often, was that one of the major reasons that investments weren't pursued was that companies had failed to take advice of regulatory input that they had been given. And this occurred when regulators give advice, they don't do it lightly, and there isn't a mandate that says you need to follow everything you've been told, but the consequences of not following it need to be considered. So from a regulatory perspective, one of the key things that we look at from a due diligence is what has been the interactions with all the regulatory agencies. Again, geographies are a key point. Are we looking only to develop in one area or multiple areas? What was the outcomes of all of those discussions? What advice has been given, and how has that advice been integrated in the onward development plans for agent? And one key thing actually is a company taking advantage of the regulatory advice it could do. So some companies do this very, very well. They are interacting with agencies, they are getting all of the advice they can. And then there are others which have not obtained any advice and just hope that they get to the end of phase 2 and everything will be accepted. So the access to regulatory advice can be a huge benefit to a program. The other part of the regulatory side is with regard mostly to the design of the pivotal studies. And there it becomes very detailed. How does the patient selection for those studies compare with the planned label and the target product profile? What kind of comparators are being chosen? And that is often an interplay between what might be the best commercial comparator but with what might be the best registration comparator. What are the efficacy endpoints? What's the expected treatment effect that's been used to generate the sample size? What's the dropout rate? What's the way that missing data is going to be handled? And all of these very detailed things become very important when you start looking at pivotal studies for registration. Other aspects of why investors decided not to. This first one, all risk pushed to the end of the development. This is the case where there may not be one huge driving, overwhelming reason not to go forward, but you see in every functional area small risks that have not been addressed or that have been left to the end. And if this happens, what it is the cumulative risk becomes compounded to a point where, although not all of them will come to pass, some of them you can be certain will. And it just creates a level of uncertainty within an investment company that this is the right option for them. A new area that's coming out as a reason people don't go forward, and this is related to market access. So a product may have the potential to get approval, but the environment around generating cost-effectiveness data and the value-based pricing strategies that are becoming more prevalent made it unlikely that they would actually achieve a commercial success, even with an approved indication. So all of these factors together were reasons why people decided not to go forward and invest. So that was kind of on the data side, but there are other elements that a due diligence assessment brings to the table that are really a byproduct. They're things that you can't, you can do your best to control, but the due diligence process tells an investment company and the team a lot about your company itself. It establishes a level of trust and integrity with the investor that is a very important but very amorphous indication. And there have been examples where an investment has not been pursued because that level of trust was destroyed during the due diligence process. So due diligence tells an investor a lot about core values. It tells a lot about core competencies. It tells the investor about risk awareness and risk management from a company. And all of these things together are giving an unwritten message that you can be trusted to take this compound through to filing and beyond, and that the company has what it takes to deliver if you choose to invest. And that's the unwritten message that comes from a due diligence assessment. So just to wrap up, due diligence isn't done without a serious intent. It's a big investment on the behalf of the investor. It's also a big investment of time and effort on the company itself. However, the upsides of due diligence, it can give you a lot of strategic input from from a team of extremely experienced drug development. If you choose to interact and to leverage that input, it can actually be very beneficial, and you can learn a lot about how your data can be looked at externally. It's very easy for companies to actually have one view of their own data, but there's a diversity out there on how that data can be viewed, and it's good to understand it. As I just mentioned, due diligence conveys more information than just data. It conveys a lot of information about trust, about core competencies, about strategic management. And the thing that our survey showed actually is that many of the issues identified in due diligence were actually preventable. Only a minority of the reasons that investors didn't go forward were related to the core scientific qualities of the molecule itself. Many of them were related to the fact that things had been delayed and postponed until they became an issue, or the development program had been done with a very small number of subjects, which creates a level of risk that then propagates forward. So many of the decisions that people make during their development actually have an impact on how their data is viewed when it comes to trying to find a partner to go forward. I'd just like to say that this viewpoint, this strategic view of all of the data is a core element of due diligence, but it's also a core element of drug development. And it's a way of looking at drug development that we pursue routinely within the organization. So with that, I'd like to wrap up and take any questions that come up.
All right, thank you so much, Fran. I'd like to encourage everybody in the audience to submit their questions to Fran, and we will answer as many as time permits. So first question is a little hard to read. I might need to have the person who asked it submit it again. But they wanted to know, do sellers use ECTD hierarchy structure as their file structure for the data room?
So the answer to that is that some do and some don't. And the ECTD structure, so one advantage is that it is a common structure across all filings. So it is actually easy to know where things are located. It is a slightly cumbersome structure in the fact that everything is sort of separated by modules so that you can find the same information in module 1 and in module 5 and in module 3. So yes, people use it. It's certainly an acceptable way to go. It does take a little bit of navigation from a reviewer's perspective.
Got it. Yeah, I see. The second part of their question was whether that the ECD hierarchy structure is useful, and it sounds like it's a little bit cumbersome is the answer. So,
well, it's cumbersome, but useful at the same time because it's a known structure.
Got it. Thank you for that clarification. Fran, someone else in our audience would like to know, in your experience, how long do most due diligences take?
So a lot of the time factors depend on the phase of development. So if you're in a phase 3 and ready to file, the amount of data for review is considerably more than if you're in a phase 1 program. So the time factor depends on two things. One is the amount of data, and two is actually the speed at which you can get missing data loaded or questions answered. So one is related to stage and the other is related to really the compliance of the company going through it. Having said that, you would estimate something in the region of a month for full due diligence.
Someone wants to know, do the reasons for not investing differ with the stage of development?
So in answer, I would probably say yes. And it relates more to the fact that the later in development you are, the less ability there is to correct course. This is a bit like changing the course of an ocean liner. To do it, you need to do it early. So factors that come up as risks in programs that are early in development are amenable to a change of course if a company is willing to consider that. Whereas by the time you get to a filing opportunity, there's very little that can be done. Either the risk's there or it isn't.
Got it. Got another question for you. Someone wants to know, in your experience, how much emphasis is placed on incorporating a robust biomarker plan, even if the mechanism of action for the drug doesn't necessarily dictate that this is required for successful development?
So a biomarker plan, companies should always consider whether a biomarker can add value during development, and there's different places it can be used. It's kind of a catch-all description. So a biomarker can be used to select patients who are more likely to respond to a drug. It can be used to monitor the response because a clinical endpoint is a very far out parameter. If having done that evaluation, there is nothing that makes sense, then there is no point in having a biomarker for the sake of a biomarker. So it's expected to be considered as part of your strategic development. But if the answer to that is that there is no applicable biomarker that could be used, then that's fine.
Fran, do you think that there are any therapeutic areas where the risks are lower?
In general, I would say no. I think risk is related to mostly a mismatch between what you say you want to achieve and your probability of actually attaining that. There are some therapeutic areas where historically agencies are more tolerant to different aspects of development, such as oncology. But that changes how you perceive risk in that situation. So it doesn't make your compounds more likely to be approved or the due diligence more likely to be effective.
Looks to be the last question from our audience. How do you know if your recommendations that you're making are the right ones?
Sometimes we never know. Sometimes we don't know what happens to some of the companies and compounds that we do an assessment of. Sometimes we see public information where a company that we've declined to go forward with has failed in its phase 3 endpoints or has been given a complete response letter from the agency. So in a way, we often only know through public statements that come out and ultimately whether they get to approval or not. So it would be very nice to go back and know actually if the risks that you identify are actually manifest or not. The reality is that we mostly don't.
Looks like we got one more question. Someone would like you to give your opinion about what you think are the best ways that companies can prepare effectively for a due diligence.
So some of the companies that we've done due diligence assessments on, they actually have started having a structured way to organize the data from the get-go, essentially. So, there's multiple ways to prepare. One is on the data side, and one is on the strategic side. So on the data side, keeping all of your data in a structured format that could be easily transferred to a data room actually makes it very easy. At the point that you decide that you're looking to get external investment or you're looking to sell an asset or whatever, you have all of the data already in one spot. The other places where companies can prepare is, in essence, around understanding, being able to clearly convey their ambitions, their project plans, the choices that they've made during those project plans, understanding the thinking behind how a program's progress actually helps a lot in understanding some of the choices that have been made. They may not be what people would make in hindsight, and hindsight's wonderful, but they can help in conveying the thought process as those decisions were made with the information available. And that can be a very useful and tangible to already have at your fingertips.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Fran, and thank you so much to our audience for all the fantastic questions that they've asked.